Today I'm here with another detransitioner, and like many others, this detransitioner is a little bit uncomfortable having their image shown because of potential repercussions. But she did want to tell her story. So why don't you just go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself? And one of the reasons that I'm interested in your story is because you actually, it sounds like you started your transition a little bit earlier than a lot of the more recent kind of ROGD kids started.
Yeah, so I was originally kind of becoming familiar with trans identities and those things probably I want to say it was probably in 2005 or 2004. So I didn't actually medically start transitioning until 2009 when I was 21. And the timeline, the reason that I wanted to share this was because my timeline is a little bit different, like we said. There wasn't, when I was originally exploring my identity and all these things, um, it was not like an explosive, largely talked about issue the way it is now. It was very much still very kind of hush hush. There was not, even social media had not exploded in the way that it has in recent years. There was maybe 3 websites at that time that I was able to find that were created by trans men at the time, um, and nothing else. And at that point, it was still very rare to find uh, women who had decided to transition to men. That was still considered to be more uncommon and more rare. And of course, now that the opposite is true. And the getting to watch the progression of how even amongst transgender people at the time, transsexual was a word that was used, viewed themselves and viewed their transition and viewed all this stuff has changed and evolved so much over the last couple of years that it's just sort of, I feel like I have a little bit of this perspective to see how, to some degree, how this has evolved to being very different than where it started. And then when I finally detransitioned, decided solidly that I needed to go back to living as female, I was in my early 30s. So I started transition in my early 20s, stopped in my early 30s. But that was also with all of the checks and balances in place because I was transitioning in a relatively conservative state. I went through therapy with, and I can get into that at some point, how maybe it wasn't as in depth as it should have been, but I still went through all of the old hoops and that you had to jump through in order to be approved for any kind of gender reassignment. And still, years later, ended up realizing that this was not a psychologically sound place for me to be in anymore.
That must be
And
a pretty heavy realization to go through those medical interventions and then realize that it wasn't really the right approach.
oh yeah, it's, anybody who spends any amount of time on, there's a detransition Reddit that has over 15, like it's 1,500 people, or sorry, 15,000 people there. It's a large amount of people that are kind of coming to that realization, and it is devastating. It's not really, it's starting to be talked about, but and that can also, implies part of the reason why I think it took me so long to get to this point was because having to acknowledge that you're sort of reinterpreting the story you used to tell yourself about who you were leads you to this conclusion of this was unnecessary. And that's devastating to be on the other side of this and realizing that. And I didn't even transition as heavily or as far as some people who have come to the same realization have. I had a mastectomy. I was on hormones for many years. I started when I was older, so I feel like I didn't change as drastically as some of these younger girls who are detransitioners who have bass voices, who have obviously like very male characteristics because they started so young before puberty. So yeah, but it's devastating, and it's it's something that's just finally starting to be talked about, I think.
Yeah, and so would you mind kind of detailing the progression? So you started on testosterone, maybe talk a little bit about the changes that you had from that, and then at what point did you determine that you wanted to have a mastectomy?
Well, I was actually the opposite when
Oh,
I chose to transition. So I feel like getting into that, I have to, like, a little bit of background was that I had been gender nonconforming, what I would call gender nonconforming, since the time I was old enough to choose my own clothes. I wanted to wear boys' clothes. I always felt self-conscious wearing girls' clothes or performing, doing anything girl activities. And I was always like that. And I, you know, it took me a little while to really realize that I was gay. And I think that part of that, the reason for that is that I feel like um, when you're a female, you're being raised as a girl. You're I don't know how to explain this, but it's like when you're a girl, you're not told that about sexual orientation. You know what I mean? Like you're not really made to think about, oh, what gets you turned on? What like who are you attracted to sexually? It's who do you fall in love with? Who are you going to fall in love with one day? And so it took me a long time to realize like that this is my sexual orientation, and that was more in my teens that I started figuring that out. But as many, especially in the 90s, when I was growing up, gender nonconforming and gay, like all those things were not, they were just on the brink of being acceptable. And when I hit puberty, I started to go through a lot of shame for being gender nonconforming. Like the first thing that people want to do as soon as they see, oh, you're hitting puberty, you're developing as a female, you have all these things. People start gifting you makeup. People start wanting to take you to the salon. People start wanting to do all this stuff that, was very not where I wanted to be at.
it's so
Um,
funny you say that. I remember one Christmas where, for whatever reason, my parents decided to stuff my stocking full of razors and makeup and
yeah,
all
right.
this girly stuff, and it just outraged me.
Yeah, same.
I just felt so betrayed because I thought, like, how could they do that? How could they be so oblivious? So I don't know if you had feelings like that.
Oh my God, absolutely. Like um, this is kind of a silly aside maybe, but um, I was really inspired by this movie called The Messenger about Joan of Arc that came out when I
Oh,
was really young. And next day I'd like chop my hair off, this whole thing. So I had already been, like on this road for forever. And it should have been, I mean, it must have been obvious to my parents. It must have been like I was getting mistaken for a boy all the time. They're like, oh, this is your son. He's so handsome, blah, 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 and they were always very self-conscious and weirded out by that.
mm.
My parents weren't homophobic in the strictest sense of the word, but I think when it came to me, they were very perturbed by some of those things. And I think that some of that trying to push me into a more, socially acceptable feminine persona was kind of what they were hoping that I was going to grow out of this.
That's so interesting because my mom was a hardcore feminist. She was, one of the first to join NOW, the National Organization of Women. She was a bra burner. She was,
That's so
always
funny.
advocating for the ERA. So it sounds like one of the things that Abigail Schreier talked about in her book Irreversible
Right.
Harms is how
Which
often
I've read.
these are
Yeah.
liberal parents who still are not quite able to accept gender nonconforming kids, lesbian daughters, or just daughters who are not fitting those stereotypes, despite the fact that as liberals they were the ones who were trying to break down some of those stereotypes. So it sounds like your parents were sort of in a similar boat.
Yeah, like my dad had lesbian friends, my mom had
Yeah.
gay friends. I think where we diverged a little bit is my mom was hyper feminine, like was in, like won pageants, like was a
Oh,
professional singer her entire life. Her persona really revolved around this extreme, and still does, this extreme vision of femininity. And
which
so,
you sure didn't conform
and I
to
was the
that at
opposite.
all. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was really challenging. And so I was very much a people pleaser when I was a kid. I very much, I didn't like to upset my parents. I didn't like to create discord or things like that. And so I think that's the beginning where these problems started, where there would be occasions, especially when I started going to a bigger, I had gone to a very small private, very liberal school for pretty much my entire life, went to Catholic school when I was in the 8th grade. So there's, already a problem there.
It's a big
And
shift.
immediately had to feel this shame of like, well, this girl is different. And, this whole like getting the pressure and the shame of like having to be this certain way from my parents and from my peers at this point. And so for the next couple of years, I started to do this yo-yo thing where for a little while I'd be like, okay, maybe I can try to dress more feminine. Maybe I could do that. And then I would feel disgusting and horrible about myself. And then I would go back and then the snide comments would start like, oh, you look so awful when you wear that. And like, oh, why don't you wear
Mhm.
this? And do you just not want to wear this because, you're more, I don't know. It just went back and forth. Um, and so then the other big problem that happened was when I was in my, I want to say my freshman year of high school, this girl that I had become very close friends with, um, who incidentally, when we were first talking before I came out to her and said, "Hey, I'm attracted to women, I'm gay," she had told me offhandedly, completely unrelated, saying, "Oh, well, I feel bad for gay people because they have a mental illness."
Oh,
And I was like, "Oh, well, that's awesome, that you feel that way, and your Catholic parents taught you that." And now I feel like total crap. Thank you.
oh,
But anyway, as our relationship progressed, she eventually told me, like, I want to be with you. I'm attracted to you, this whole
wow.
thing. And so my parents had been dancing around this kind of shame thing for a while with it's very obvious what I am and nobody is willing to say it. You know what I mean? Where it's just like silence. My dad would
Mm.
sometimes say weird offhanded stuff like, oh, I had a patient who was a lesbian, but she realized that women were so much of a pain in the ass that she doesn't date women anymore. And I
Oh,
was like, okay, that was like out of the blue, like no context. He just says this to me. And I'm like,
oh,
okay, thank you very much for that. That's great. Um, so I'm dating this girl. I can't tell my parents. She can't tell her parents. So I was in this secret relationship for 3 years.
wow.
All the while, my mom is still kind of, anytime a boy showed any interest in me whatsoever, she would be so encouraging and so like, oh, this is wonderful that he loves you, likes you, and blah, 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 blah. If any man whatsoever showed any kind of sexual interest in me at all, it was this gushing, wonderful thing. And any time that I started to go back to my old ways, it was like this kind of shame thing. So it was this yo-yo thing. I'm already living with the shame of being in this relationship I can't tell anybody about.
Not to
Um,
mention that your girlfriend thinks that that you both have mental illness. That's really
yeah, well, and
what
I
a
and, and I definitely know she doesn't think that anymore. But there was definitely when I started to kind of cave from the shame and feel like there's something horribly wrong with me because of all this stuff. And I found this trans identity, and I already am ashamed of being a lesbian. I hate the word lesbian at this point. Like, I can't even, I don't like to associate myself with it because of all this. It's like, oh, well, here's the problem. You know, maybe the reason that I don't feel right being a quote unquote woman is because I'm not. And my girlfriend at the time was very encouraging because I now, and I'm not thinking this way as a teenager, but in retrospect and having meditated on this and thought of this for so long, I think that she would have been relieved with me being male because I think she was dealing with her own shame and weird issues. And it was, and we both were at this point, I was dealing with eating disorders because we were young teenage girls in the 90s. And that was like very common back then. Um, there's a lot of
and what you're
overlap.
saying, I hear so often that if you transition, then you can walk down the street as a straight couple and nobody even turns their eye.
Yeah,
Whereas being a lesbian, it 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 comes with conflict and it comes with risk and
right.
it comes with condemnation. And so, to me, it makes perfect sense that you could easily say, well, I was gender nonconforming as a kid. Clearly, I was just born in the wrong body. I'm just going to
Mhm.
go ahead and transition.
Yeah, and when one of the things I wanted to say that one of the conclusions I've come to. So, well, let me finish the story first, and then I can get into that. So this thing happened, and so I finally came to my parents and said, "Hey, I think that I'm trans." I had not told them about my girlfriend, nothing. I think that they were suspicious because, I mean, how do you keep a 3-year long relationship secret for that long? I mean, it's easier when you're girls, because when you're girls, oh, they're just friends, blah, blah,
Just
blah,
having a sleepover.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. It's just a sleepover. And, so there's all this stuff. And they were very not accepting of that, but I had enough gender nonconformity in my background to point to say, oh, well, obviously here's all the signs.
Uh,
And um, my dad took me to a psychologist who was a personal friend of his, which I think was one of the biggest mistakes. Because this was before I think even the affirmative model was like so fiercely promoted as it is now. But this is a personal friend of my dad's. How am I going to tell her everything that I've been going through in my life? How am I going to come out to her and say, oh yeah, by the way, I've been dating this girl for 3 years, and this whole thing. And when I came out as trans, that was already a trauma there, because my dad was like, well, if she's the cause of this, you're never going to see her again. And he ended it right then and there. It's like, we're not allowed to be around her anymore. You're not, she's never coming over here again. So that was traumatic, because here's this relationship that just ended. I couldn't really do anything. But by that point, I was so,
Boy, and if that
sort of,
didn't like push you into wanting to transition, I don't know what would.
oh yeah,
I mean,
especially as a teenager where it's like,
yeah.
oh, okay. So by then I was getting very resolved in this is the thing. And what I wanted to say about that was, I think one of the things that I used to believe that I no longer believe, that is promoted so heavily now, is that gender dysphoria never alleviates.
Mm.
That if you experience it and you feel it, you will experience it, feel it for the rest of your life, and your options are either transition or suicide. There's the only two ways out. There's the only two ways to deal with this.
So is that the message that you got?
That is the message that even back then
Wow.
I had got. Now the idea of being transgender without gender dysphoria didn't exist yet. That was still
Right. That's relatively new.
that was still on the horizon. But the idea that gender dysphoria was something that you cannot change no matter what you do, or can never alleviate with time, or any of these things, was very much the narrative. And
Which is
when I
so
was,
strange because they must have, I mean, it's so strange to me that that narrative was in the 90s, because by then Ken Zucker had started to do some research on gender identity, and would
right,
have known that there was, a high chance of desistance
yeah,
going forward.
I
So
wrote
it's,
this
it's
number
like
down.
you were the
Yeah.
generation right after me where nobody affirmed me. There was just no question. It was just find ways to help me to manage and resolve the dysphoria, whereas with you it was this idea that well, you're trans, we just better move forward.
Well, and it wasn't even quite as aggressive as that, even when I was going through it. It was still my therapist, regardless of the fact that I did not share things with her that I definitely should have shared it still was about a year before she was willing to even give me a diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
But once you got that diagnosis, the idea was that you had it for life.
Yeah, like that was still kind of the overarching idea. I think she was still cautious about weeding out other potential options first, other potential things that were going on with me. But again, and I feel like that was because of this shameful sort of traumatic situation that I had been locked in for so long. I didn't want to tell her about my personal life in a real way. And so I didn't.
Especially being a friend of your father's. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it was very strange. It was very strange. And even through all that, nobody was willing to say the word lesbian. So there
Wow.
you go. Very weird. But anyway, yeah, so I feel like the idea that this thing never can shift or change, and I feel like another opinion that I have, because man, if somebody had said this to me when I was very much on this path and decided that's who I was, it would have pissed me off to no end. I would have been furious. I would have been, this is horrible, blah blah blah. But this is after 10 years of experience, that I'm saying this. So this was not my initial thought. Like anybody who's watching this who's like, oh, this person was never really trans, they were never really gender dysphoric. Like, of course I was. I convinced somebody in a conservative state after a year and a half of therapy that I had gender dysphoria, and then she diagnosed me with it. Like, how is that not, how can you say that's a false diagnosis, you know? I just think
Well, and
the
that to
problem
me
is,
is it's just a incredibly dismissive and really demeaning, I think, to say, well, you were never really trans. Obviously you were. You went through, you know, you had your breasts removed, you took testosterone. Obviously there was something going on. And what I think it is that there's this part of the movement is trying to, part of it is trying to say you don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans, but then there's this other part to say there's like people who are true trans, and
yes,
true
yeah,
trans are, you know, they really have to have these interventions. And so it's like they're trying to, you know, they're kind of speaking out both sides of their mouth in this, but
it's
it's
very true.
unfortunate that people like you who are detransitioning are being belittled with this idea of, well, you don't get to speak about this because you were not authentically trans.
Right. And again, I feel like the idea of what being trans even means has changed so much over the last couple of years that, you know, that's the narrative now. I don't know what it's going to be in another 10 years, but the idea that gender dysphoria can never alleviate is part of why people will say, oh, well, you were never trans to begin with. And I think another aspect of it is the trans medicalist perspective, which was originally one that I kind of, you know, liked in the beginning, but one that I have also gradually begun to doubt, where they say, oh, well, you know, um, trans men have male brains and trans women have female brains. And I'm like, well, if that's true, why is nobody doing any brain scans in these diagnoses? If it's really that drastic a difference, why is that not part of it? Because it isn't, and because it's not a drastic difference.
Well, and there's actually some really interesting. I talked to Patrick Lappert, is actually a plastic surgeon who's gotten really interested in this, and he talked about how brain scans of people who have lived as transgender for a while, or, you know, presented as the opposite gender for a while, wouldn't actually even provide you with information because our brains are so malleable. And so,
Right,
you know, just our behavior changes our brain as much as our brain influences our behavior.
right,
So I think that trying to even, I mean, fundamentally, at a chromosomal level, we're different. We're male and female, but to, you know, the idea that you could have a male brain born into a female body, I find really offensive.
well, in a way it's very strange that like some views that have definitely been accepted as very sexist, like the idea that, oh, women have worse cognition because their brains are smaller, or all this stuff, that male brains and female brains are so drastically different. That's been completely rejected, but in this new context, it's sort of being reinvigorated in a different way.
Well, and I think
And
that
it's
there are a
still
lot
very
of
strange.
kids like who are quirky. Like, you know, I'm really interested. I get really excited about number patterns, which is not something most girls do. And
Mhm.
so somebody might argue, well, you know, clearly you have a male brain, rather than saying we can have all kinds of female brains.
Right. No, exactly. And that, you know, and I'd be curious to say, well, put a brain scan of a butch lesbian next to a trans man. Is there going to be a difference?
Mhm.
You know, like if we're going to play that game, I mean, you know,
Right,
like with all that stuff.
right.
Anyway, so basically, you know, at 21, I had a mastectomy done first,
Oh,
and then I
wow.
started testosterone after that. And even after I had a mastectomy, I was still very nervous about going on hormones because I knew even back then that there could be physiological issues, um, you know, health issues and things of that nature that could arise. I did it anyway. At that point, I was starting a relationship with this woman that I've been with many, many years, who I'm still with today.
Oh, wow.
And basically, I feel like the initial, because I mean, this is another misnomer that I hear, that people say, like, oh, well, if you feel amazing after you transition, that means you did the right thing.
Right.
And
And that's
I,
the other thing that
yeah,
research is coming out and showing, that testosterone actually does give you a bit of a high. Um,
oh yeah, it does. It does, and coming off of it makes you feel awful, because I tried more than once to stop while I was still on it, and I would end up feeling so lethargic and miserable and, you know, weepy and just gross for like the first couple weeks that I would eventually go back on. And again, use that
Wow.
as evidence of, oh, maybe I really am trans. Maybe I really do need this, without realizing it's
Wow.
like, no, it's your body. Your body is used to this hormone, and it's not evidence of anything other than
It's
your
like coming off
hormonal balances.
heroin. You're gonna feel
Yeah,
like
your hormonal.
crap for a while.
Right. No, exactly. And so, but again, this idea that if you feel great about it in the beginning, it means you did the right thing. So I had so many issues going on. First of all, I had been terrified to be female for most of my life. My parents were extremely protective. And that, I'm not saying that was a bad thing. I think, thankfully have never been a victim of sexual assault. I know plenty of women have. But, the fear of walking through the world as female was gone. The fear of being judged for being a lesbian was gone. The my anorexia issues. I mean, I never
Mhm.
was medicalized for anything like that, but I definitely had eating disorders. Suddenly, I lost a lot of weight on testosterone, and my body went into an androgynous shape, which is what I had always been aiming for. And so it's like, of course, all these things are going to make me feel really good for a while, And same with one of the big ones that a lot of even trans men have spoken about is the way that people treat you and talk to you when they perceive you as a man versus a woman is night and day. People don't believe me when I say that sometimes. They think, oh, well, no, it's just because they're not looking at you in a sexual way anymore. I'm like, no, people respect you when you're a man. They listen to you. I could say the same thing as a woman and people will be like, oh, okay. And I say it as a man and they're like, oh, how insightful. You
Well,
know?
you've seen both sides of it. It kind of reminds me of that story. I don't know if this is like um, required reading in high school anymore, but when I was a kid, we had to read Black Like Me, and it was a
Mm,
story of a man who I don't know how he did it, but somehow he was able to um, convince people that he was black and kind of be treated as black and was able to write about the ways in which his experience was different and really document how profoundly differently he was treated as a black person versus a white person. And so
right.
you've done that. You've walked in men's shoes. You know what it's like. So I think your experience is really valuable.
And I think that's part of the reason why I took so long to get to the point that I did, was because even in moments where I knew I wasn't okay, where like something that would happen very frequently was I would start to have, because I personally kind of subscribe to the idea that sometimes our dreams can tell us what's going on subconsciously in our heads, and I would be having dreams that I needed to look female for some reason in the dream, and I wasn't completely unable to. Or I would have dreams that my breasts would grow back or my voice would go back to how it was before I transitioned. And it would be like a good thing. It was relief. And I would
Huh.
wake up and then have to deal with this whole slew of what the hell did that mean?
Dissonance.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's another thing that is an opinion I hold now that I definitely would not have held back then. So, and it's hard, and I have to say this delicately because I still have trans friends and family that I love that I think are doing, they're doing what's right for them on whatever level they can. And this isn't to invalidate that, but to just say that I think a big problem happened when we started looking at gender identity or gender dysphoria as an identity versus a disorder.
I would agree. I mean, I think
Because
that that's
yeah,
and and part of it is I feel like we've almost taken gender identity disorder from the individual and put it on society, because really what you're talking about, the differences in the way women are sexualized, the way they're treated.
oh yeah,
um,
look at our president. We elected a
yeah,
man, put him like and people always ask like it's so mysterious. Like, oh, why do all these girls suddenly identify as trans? It's a
right.
mystery. And it's like, why do you think?
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know?
when you think about, I mean, even and as an older woman, I still, I mean, it's funny. One of the things that I don't know if you know this, but I shaved my head about 9 months ago, and it's amazing to me how many people feel the need to comment on my hair. Oh, it looks so pretty. And if I were a
Mhm.
guy, that would not be happening.
Cool.
I
Oh,
mean,
yeah, look, a female rapper writes wet ass pussy and it's the end of the world. Everybody's freaking out. Oh my
yeah, I
God,
mean,
and
it
it's like,
just really, it's not surprising to me, especially as our society is becoming, I mean, increasingly sexualized, where girls, younger and younger and younger
yes.
are being encouraged to view themselves as sexual objects. it's not surprising to me that so many girls are deciding to adopt this. But I feel like it is a mental disorder of our society at this point, that that we have decided that it's okay to sexualize women and girls to such an extent that now
Right.
women and girls are afraid to be women and girls.
Yeah, well, and even, I mean, something that I'm going to get back to that in a second, but I was just, before I forget, something that I have definitely found in my current exploration is like, we see gender nonconformity being celebrated a lot, but not by women. We have RuPaul's Drag Race. Everybody in America can name 5 drag queens off the top of their heads now because of that. And I'm not saying that's not awesome, but at the end of the day, drag is still a male fantasy of what a woman is. And we very rarely see gender nonconforming women in any kind of meaningful or, kind of inspirational place in the same way. You know what I mean?
Usually, a
Um,
gender nonconforming woman is just an ugly,
oh,
unattractive
yeah,
woman.
exactly.
I mean,
Or the butt of a lesbian joke is like
exactly.
in the 90s. That's all it was. The only time I
Yeah.
ever saw Butch lesbians represented was on friggin' Jerry Springer and lesbian seagull and like just stupid jokes. It was never something that was celebrated in any way, shape, or form. And there's still not really much representation for it.
Well, and it
And I,
reminds me of an interview I did with Joey Bright, who is an older lesbian. So she was in the lesbian community for a long time, and she's a butch lesbian. And she's really talked about how there really are no butch lesbians anymore because they're all transitioning, and how
right,
that is really it's sad that all these butch lesbians have decided that they need to be men because being a butch lesbian is just sort of too difficult.
right. And so, yeah, I guess, so what I was getting at with that I think it's unfortunate that gender dysphoria is now being viewed as an identity rather than a disorder, is that I feel like in I read these detransitioners stories, all the time. Like, I'm in this group, I read, and, everybody's just sharing these things that have happened. And, and again, like you said, talking out both sides of your mouth. On one hand, there's this strong push to, like, uh, we need to destigmatize mental illness.
Right.
But then at the same time, if you imply that gender dysphoria is a mental illness now, then it's like, oh, that's horrible and offensive that you would think that. But with a disorder, if you view it as a disorder, the point of dealing with the disorder is to get relief for the disorder.
Find ways to
And no
manage
matter
it or
how,
resolve it. Right.
yeah, resolve it, no matter what that looks like.
Hmm.
I genuinely still believe that for some people, their gender dysphoria is so debilitating and crippling that unless they physically transition, they cannot function in the world. I believe that is still a valid experience. And I think that's a problem we have in America. We're so black and white about everything. It's either extreme, everything is this way, or everything is that way. There can't be a gray area. And I do think there are people who experience that, but I think those people are very rare. Like you said with Kenneth Zucker's study, where he found that 88% of these kids would kind of come out of it on their own. And I think that people, like we were finally talking about, well, at 25 people start, their brains stop developing. And so it's sort of like you've not eliminated other possibilities besides just surgery by that point. And again, but that's because it's become an identity that
Yeah,
you're
it's so
saying,
interesting that you put it that way because I'm thinking about my gender dysphoria is almost completely now dismissed by trans activists because I figured out how to first manage and then, ultimately mostly resolve it. And
yeah,
so because it's not an identity, they completely dismiss it. And yet it's an important part of my history. It's an important
right,
part of, how I experienced childhood that is now just completely dismissed because it's no longer considered a mental disorder or some kind of a mental health issue. It's now an identity. And so,
right. And with an identity, there's no room for change.
right,
With a
yeah.
disorder, there's room to want to change it and heal it in some way, shape, or form. Once it's an identity, then it's wrapped up in your ego, and then your ego has to defend it. So
And
if
they
you,
also have to defend that it can't change because if it can change, then their argument that we need to start transitioning these kids at an early age falls apart.
right, and the thing is, I get why that narrative came into play, Because if we're talking like, I think it's totally worth noting that, one of the bigger cases of like probably the first big public case of a sex reassignment surgery happening was this woman, Christine Jorgensen, in
Mhm.
America in the 1950s. And that's really kind of when you started to see these gender reassignment surgeries beginning. In the 50s, during the exact same time, it was literally illegal to be gay or cross-dress. So it makes you wonder, like, were these people just in this horrible bottleneck 1950s culture where they could not literally could not exist any other way? Like,
Well,
were
it's
these,
like in Iran where homosexuality gets the death penalty. So you have a choice between being killed or transitioning.
yeah, and it very well could have been like that. So I guess what I mean to say is that there's so much nuance here that that to just say that this single narrative that is a very new one is the only possibility is messing up a lot of people's heads, and causing people to transition. The saddest ones for me, because this is around the time that knew what I was struggling with, and seeing like young teenage girls that have this rapid onset gender dysphoria, and then um, come out the other end of it wanting to be feminine and wanting, at least I was gender non-conforming, and at least I still am. I can't even imagine where I would be right now if I came to the realization, oh my God, I'm a straight woman and I've wanted to be feminine this whole time. Like, but I see that a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it is because of this idea that gender dysphoria is, again, that it's something that's born in you, like being gay, that it's like, this is who you are, this is who you've always been, your body's the problem, so we need to fix that, versus acknowledging that there are, like, what's the difference between feeling uncomfortable with your gender and gender dysphoria? What is the difference?
And
Is
I
there
would
one?
guess that most women actually feel uncomfortable with their gender
Oh my
identity.
God.
I
And I wish
mean,
somebody had told me that. I wish somebody had told me, hey,
yeah,
like, if I had had like a few butch lesbian mentors in my life when I was younger, it would have been great to hear, like, yeah, like, you were not locked into being this way just because you have two X chromosomes. And also, there's not a woman on the planet who hasn't hated being female. Look at our culture. Look at the world we live in. Of course, and but I was taught to believe, or led to believe, I should say, that if you had felt uncomfortable with these roles and uncomfortable with your body as a woman, it meant you weren't one. Which is like, then nobody's a woman, Like, who's a woman?
exactly.
Because
Yeah, for
everybody
sure.
felt that, and I didn't know that back then. I'm
Which is
really
where I
surprised.
almost feel like this is going, is the erasure of male and female, which is really sad because I feel like girls these days are growing up feeling like there is something inherently wrong with being female, and I really want them to have good, strong female role models so that they don't feel that way. But if all those good, strong female role models are coming out and saying that they're gender non-conforming or gender fluid or non-gender or transgender, then it's going to
Yeah,
be really confusing to these kids.
yeah, and very, and it's never going to help them get through it.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads into, I mean, this is a little bit into woo-woo land, I guess, but what finally kind of cracked through it for me, because I had been going through this struggle for so
Yeah,
long.
I was curious, like, did you, as you said that you tried to get off the testosterone a couple of times, at what age did you start to to decide maybe you wanted to get off the testosterone?
Ironically, probably about the time I was, well, probably sooner than this, but I think by the time I was reaching 23, that 25
Oh, wow.
range was really when I started going, okay,
Mm.
is this really necessary for me to keep doing this? And, you know, it, two things happened that really snapped me out of it. So the first one is the unusual one. And I don't know if this is ever going to be something that's going to be investigated by later people. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, because I'm not the only person who said this. But I had an experience with psilocybin mushrooms, and it was the first time I had ever had them. And something about it just broke through this ego cocoon that I had built around myself, this male persona I had built around myself. And I had just these moments, just looking back in my life, and this big aha moment where I was like, you know what? I have two X chromosomes, so anything I do is normal for a female. Any
Wow.
way I am, any way I dress, any way I talk, anybody I have sex with, this is like, this does not make me female. I am female and I do these things. This is a normal way to be female. And
Wow.
I swear that it had never occurred to me before in that way, because I had had all the shame wrapped around being gender nonconforming, that it literally was not permissible in my mind that if I didn't match some form of femininity and feel comfortable with it in myself, that I was genuinely female. You know what I
Wow.
mean? It was
That just
very
makes me
strange.
so sad. I mean, my heart just feels so sad right now hearing that, that for, for that many years, you just had this thought that you weren't the right kind of female, and that because of
And
that.
I didn't want, and I kind of didn't want to be at that point.
Yeah.
I had a lot of, these words are starting to get used more. But I didn't have this terminology back then, but internalized misogyny and internalized homophobia are huge, real problems. Um, and
And so
the
you
thing
said there
about
were
it,
two things that the psilocybin was one. What was the
that
other
snapped
one?
me out of it. The other thing that snapped me out of it was I had the first pap smear I'd ever had in my life. And at that point, and this is going to happen to anybody who's on testosterone for a long enough time. It's just the reality. People can wrap it up however they want, but this is the truth. I had really terrible atrophy, so much so that they had to put me on uh, another round of hormones that was just sort of topically applied estrogen in order to get my tissue to heal enough to even do a pap smear.
Wow.
So being kind of faced with that reality after having been dissociated from my body and my head for so long and all this stuff, it kind of put me at a crossroad where I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to deal with this one way or another. Like I had been kind of, even though I kind of knew that there were some things psychologically going on with me that weren't good anymore, I had to kind of choose, okay, am I going to follow this to its natural conclusion where I end up with a hysterectomy and all these things down the road? Because I had not had one at that point.
And
Because
that, and so many women who are on testosterone for a while, especially when they're young, end up
that's like one of
having
the
to
first
have a
things they do.
hysterectomy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard different things. I've heard from two endocrinologists that I worked with that that's not necessary to do that. Um, there were early concerns about whether it could cause cervical cancer, all these other things, but then some people say no, there's not a more heightened risk of that. It's just nobody has a clear answer.
Well, I've heard of extreme pain and atrophy
And
that can
I was
happen.
starting to have that, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure why my body took so long to get to this point. Some people get to this point in their first 2 or 3 years. I was on testosterone for about probably 9 years altogether.
And it
And
might have to do with dosage. It might have to do with, how much estrogen
yeah,
is still in your system.
and I'm a tall person.
Okay.
I have a bigger body. So that could, I don't know if that has anything to do with it, why the dosage wasn't quite as intense for me. I'm not sure. But the point is that I had this crossroad that I had to deal with, and I had already had the psilocybin episode, and I'm like, what am I doing? Is this worth it to keep doing this? And then of course there's all the fear of like, well, I've been living as a man for 10 years. I've never experienced what life is like to live as a woman. I've never been out as a lesbian before in my entire life. Like, and that initial fear of like, is it even worth it to try? You know, my voice is permanently changed. I had a mastectomy, like all this stuff. Like, it held me back for a while before this realization with the atrophy to move through that. And then it became an issue of, well, I can stop testosterone. Does that mean I have to detransition? Like, because there's two separate questions. There are
Mhm.
plenty of trans men who still feel more comfortable identifying as men, but then, just stop taking testosterone at some point. And I finally got to the point where I realized for myself that this is a that there were all these issues of shame I was finally willing to look at, all of these issues of internalized homophobia, and I was like, I'm never going to be able to work through this as a man. I'm never going to be able to work through this stuff and accepting myself as a masculine born female unless I can acknowledge and forgive the female part. like finally finding a balance of these are two distinct parts of me that exist within me, and I'm trying to kill one of them, and I'm never going to be at peace. As long as I was trying to destroy my masculine side, I was miserable. And then on the opposite end of that, I was starting to feel miserable doing the other, you know, trying to kill my female self off. And
That's
because
such a, I think that's such an important insight that really, um, you cannot accept yourself if you're trying to radically
destroy
change
yourself.
yourself. Yeah,
Yeah.
and feel yourself. Yeah, I mean, it's this, it's almost a dissociation,
Oh, it's
or
absolutely a dissociation. And
yeah.
you know, very heavily felt dissociated from my body, from my past. You know, it was very strange to look at pictures of me from when I was young, when I was a little girl or older. It kind of, something about transitioning definitely, it's like you create a persona in a way, you know, to protect yourself. And you live in that for so long that it's, you know, I don't know how to explain that. It's like you have to destroy your old self to create this new self. But can you really ever destroy who you are, you know?
So
And I
you,
don't know.
it sounds like you've been on a journey recently of just trying to figure out who you are and how to accept yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been you know, it's been challenging. When I got together with my partner, it was under the belief that I was going to live as a man and I was going to be a trans man. And now it's sort of like, well, how are we going to navigate this as a female couple? You know, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I was curious how she responded because I have heard of cases where somebody has been living as transgender, typically transgender man, and decided to detransition, and their partner's not happy about it because they don't identify as lesbian, and so
Yeah.
it impacts the sort of the identity of the partner. How is your girlfriend or wife? I'm not sure.
Yeah, my
Significant
wife.
other.
Yeah.
How has
She,
she handled that?
she, you know, I'm not going to say that there haven't been issues because there have been, you know, having to restructure and refigure things out, but we're both really committed to our relationship and still really love each other. And she's more probably, I mean, if we have to put a label on it, she kind of prefers like a pansexuals, kind of where she lands a little more, but it's still, you know, there's still a mourning process. And I think that that's something that's not addressed with detransitioners very much, you know, like I hate to see, like, most of the time when I see trans people talking about detransitioners, it's almost always these really young female to male teenage kids that are judging the shit out of these women or
Hmm.
these other girls, you know, and being like, oh God, they're so awkward, they're so cringy, you know, this is so horrible, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, how is that not internalized misogyny? You know, like that to me is like a dark mirror. It's like if you're lashing out and hating that, there's something inside of you that resonates with that. That's like, we're destroying that. You know, like, I don't know. That's just how it looks to me from a psychological level. Like there's this weird shaming thing going on with it where, oh, girls are flippant, girls are silly. They just make these rash decisions and they get on these like, what do you call it? These just bandwagons and they just, you know, and it's again, it's misogyny. And
Well,
I,
especially it's very dismissive to say, well, it's just a social contagion because it
yeah,
that misses the fact that, I mean, eating disorders are just social contagions too, and anorexia is the deadliest mental health issue that there is,
oh my, yeah,
and
it's devastating.
it's profound, and it's not just, it is a serious thing that it is a social contagion and really indicates that there's something going on in our society that's causing these social contagions to be able to infect so many young girls.
Yeah, and so it can be really devastating. It can be, you know, you're mourning the loss of who you thought you were, because again, this is not being treated like a disorder. This is an identity now. So you're having an identity crisis. Your identity is blown apart. You, you know, are mourning what you could have been, who you could have been. You're mourning the loss of years and years that you could have been learning to be okay with yourself. At least that's how it was for me. You know, I look back with so much regret now, not necessarily because I feel like I reached a point of no return, because you know, I feel like I'm ambiguous enough to kind of go either way at this point. I know that I'm not sharing my image on here, but just take my word for it, I guess, viewers. But you know, it's just, you know, it's, I don't even know how to explain this. I feel like when people go through like even a normal not a normal, but like a regular major surgery or an amputation or things like that, we definitely acknowledge that there's a psychological effect there that happens. And I feel like that's not being treated the same way in this particular instance, where it's like, where people have permanently altered their bodies and there's so much grief attached to that, that I feel like it's sort of getting, instead of being treated with compassion because it's sort of going against this narrative of it contradicts the narrative of this is unchanging, that dysphoria is unchanging, that it gets swept under the carpet, and these people don't want to be dealt with. So the way you deal with it is by saying, oh well, they were just flippant teenagers, or they weren't really trans, and they didn't really know. And yeah, that's really damaging too. So
Well, and it strikes me as just it's sort of dismissing the kind of harm that girls are doing to themselves because they're so uncomfortable being female in our society.
yeah, or boys too.
Or
You know,
boys, yeah, that
the same
it's now
happens with them.
boys too, because because this movement is now reinforcing these harmful stereotypes on boys now. And so,
Yeah,
I have no doubt that there are boys who are now struggling, more feminine boys that are going to go ahead and jump on board the trans wagon, because boy, is it going to make their life easier not to be called a sissy, or any of the
yeah.
other horrible names that feminine boys get called.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, I get it to a degree why this narrative came into being, because, you know, people were trying to make, you know, trans people, like early on when it was very rare and not very common, just wanted to be treated like human beings. You know, these are the people I talked about who, when it was almost impossible to get this done, were so debilitated by living as their birth sex that they had to do something to exist. And in order to make that sympathetic in people's eyes, they had to talk about how, hey, I felt this way from since the time I was 3. It's never changed. I've been more and more miserable. And then this was the final conclusion, because that's a story you can empathize with. To be like, oh, this is an unchanging thing. This is just who these people are. You know, I get it. But that narrative isn't helpful anymore.
And in fact, again, it's further stigmatizes mental health issues. And that's where I get really frustrated is,
Right.
why can't we embrace this as a mental health issue and acknowledge that, as for other mental health issues, there are all different ways of managing and treating it, rather than trying to insist that it's an innate identity that's unchangeable.
Right. And I feel like it's inevitable that we're going to get there. You know, the amount of young girls that are taking on trans identities and choosing to transition to male is just at an astronomical level right now, even more so than, you know, boys that are transitioning to be females. Um, and, you know, there's more and more detransitioners coming out. I see more and more accounts go up on YouTube all the time. And I think it's only a matter of time before this becomes, unfortunately, a lot of people's lives are going to have to be thrown through the wood chipper before this is going to happen, but it's going to have to be talked about eventually. And we're not quite at the tipping point yet, but, you know, I feel like a lot of these younger people might end up going through the same experience that I did, which is why I wanted to share this. Just as an alternate way to say, like, hey, you can be as gender nonconforming as you want. That doesn't have to mean anything. All that being male or female means is that you have two X chromosomes or an XY chromosome. Like, it doesn't, that's it. That's the only rule. There's nothing else. Everything else is out the window. You can make it whatever the hell you want it to be, and it's right, you know? Um, and a lot of people don't really believe that. I didn't really believe that for a long time.
Well, and I think
But
girls really are going to benefit by role models like you, so that they can say, oh, this, just because I don't want to wear dresses and bows and perfume and makeup doesn't mean that I'm not a woman, that I can, there are lots of different ways to be a woman. And
yeah, like,
having role models
really.
like you will be really important.
Yeah, I'm trying. It's, you know, that's part of the reason that I felt like detransitioning was so important for me, because once I started to understand these things, I was going to be a hypocrite if I didn't, you know, where it's like, oh, I wish I had had these females, the role models in my life. And I'm like, well, then where the hell am I? Somebody else might need that one
Mhm.
day, you know, what am I doing? Except proving to them that you can't be this, you know?
So how
So,
are you doing now? Do you feel, I mean, it is, as you said, it's a radical change, and I'm sure that you're doing some serious mourning. I know that, you know, anytime someone has kind of a big shift in their life, there's sort of this time of reassessment. Do you feel like you're through that, or are you still in the process of sort of trying to figure out where you're going to land?
oh, I'm still figuring it out. I mean, we all are, right? Really. But in that regard, I stopped taking testosterone actually in March of this year. So it's only been, I don't know, what is it, six months since then? Or has it been 6 months, something like that? It hasn't been that long, really. So I'm still very much in a kind of reevaluation mourning process, you know. Like I said, the biggest parts that are hard for me was I really miss my singing voice. I used to
Mhm.
have a really
Oh, I've
beautiful singing
heard
voice.
that. Yeah.
And that's one I hear that's so common. So I would just say to anybody who's considering transitioning, if you love your singing voice, just wait. Please just wait. Wait till you're 25 and your brain's still developing. And if it's still debilitating by then and you cannot function, then think about it then. But there are just so many other ways to be. And we're just so extreme in Western culture where it's like you have to be this way if you're this and you have to be that way if you're that,
And
you know?
be gender nonconforming. There's no rule that says um, that you have to take testosterone if you have gender
No.
dysphoria.
Absolutely not. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And it's not necessarily true that your gender dysphoria is going to be alleviated by doing it, you know?
Right.
Like there's definitely the high and the excitement of the new in the first couple of years, but sooner or later you're going to stop being that cool, cute, 20-something-year-old trans guy and you're going to have hair growing out of your nose and your ears and you're going to be balding and that's the reality of being male, like and for some people that's the right place for them. They're like, yes, this is what I wanted. Like this has made me feel whole. This has made me feel like I can function in my own life in my own skin. But I think for the majority of people that are doing it now, I don't see it going in that direction.
And I
um
just see there's going to be such anger and devastation when these girls realize that they've been lied to and told that it is possible to be born in the wrong body because
right.
and the parents are going to be enraged too when they realize that this idea that their kids are going to kill themselves unless they're allowed to transition is a lie. I mean, these
Oh
are
god,
two.
you want to talk about wanting to kill yourself, go on that detransition Reddit for a second. Like as if that doesn't want cause kids to want to kill themselves is transition regret.
Yeah,
Holy crap, like
yeah,
how can you dismiss that?
especially these young kids who, they're permanently, their voices are deep, their fertility is compromised, and they're going to have ongoing
Health
medical
issues for the rest of
complication.
their life. Yeah, and that's a fear for me. I mean, luckily, my body has bounced back from this. I'm having a regular cycle again. I don't seem to have lasting damage for whatever reason, but that's not going to be the case for everybody. And I still don't know if that's entirely the case for me. I don't know what's going to happen to me in 20 years, 30, 40 years. I don't know.
Right. Yeah,
But
because essentially you've been in a self-induced menopause
yes,
for a while.
yeah, for like 9 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there's the fear of that looming over my head. There's, like I said, the loss. I think the biggest, saddest thing for me, and again, like this is such a sensitive issue, so it's so hard to express it sometimes. But self-love, and I know, again, I've heard a couple people even on your show say that self-love is important, but not people don't really get that. They think, oh, self-love means loving that I have this disorder or this identity, which means loving that I want to transition and all this other stuff. And you can view it that way, but there's also like, you know from the time I can remember being young, it's just the state of affairs in America, especially, that women are told they have to change themselves before they're acceptable in some way, shape, or form. Your boobs aren't big enough, you're too skinny, you're too fat, you're too whatever. Like we're sort of in this like compression chamber of just taught to be dissatisfied, because that keeps the makeup people in business, that keeps the fashion people in business, that keeps the plastic surgeons in business, that we're just taught to never be satisfied with who we are. And for me, like letting go of that need to change myself was just such a relief. And just being able to say that, what, like this, and that's the biggest regret for me, that I wish I could have learned to love myself before I changed myself. I wish that I could
Do
love
you have
myself as
any
I was.
advice on that? Because that's something that I think I mean, really that ability to just say, this is who I am with all the flaws, with, all the dissatisfaction, but I'm going to love myself rather than allowing, I want to say this, the bastards to sort of dictate whether or not I'm okay, which is kind of how I
Yeah,
feel. I know that that's kind of strong language, but I just have
yeah,
this
no,
sense
really.
of like, we need to somehow teach kids that they get to define themselves, that they don't have to listen to the outside world telling them they're not okay.
Yeah, I wish I had an answer for that because it's something that came to me with age. When you're a teenager and in your early 20s, it's so hard to be satisfied with who you are because you're inundated with media and influences telling you that it's not acceptable to be comfortable with who you are. Or, well, you can be comfortable with who you are, but only when you weigh this much.
Or
Or
only if other
only,
people are comfortable with who you are.
yeah, or when you reach this milestone, then you can finally relax and be comfortable. And the truth is, if that sense of self-love doesn't come from within, it's not going to come from anywhere else. Like nothing can fix it. It doesn't matter how much little or much you weigh, like it doesn't matter. It's all meaningless. So I guess what I would say is, I don't know, like lately, I guess what I've been kind of trying to do, despite the fact that I've permanently altered my body, is to go like, you know what, like this is the me that I incarnated as. This is me. Like these are my legs. These are my arms. This is my voice. This is my face. Like these are the things that uniquely have created who I am. And instead of trying to change them to fit somebody else's ideal, I should just love and accept what it is. To be like, this is uniquely me. This is who I am. And I know it's so hard to try to put that into words, but it's just a feeling of just acceptance. It's not, maybe self-acceptance is even a better word than self-love, because sometimes self-love can be very hard, but just accepting. And we're so taught in America not to accept, that we need the biggest, better, wonderful thing before we're allowed to feel okay. That's what keeps everybody in business, like, I'm finally going to be happy when I have this car. I'm finally going to be happy when I have these clothes. I'm finally going to be happy. And the truth is that, acceptance of what is such a more powerful gift than anything else,
Well, and
because
I
nothing
also
is
wonder
about
if,
that.
people are constantly trying to change themselves and they don't accept who they are. It's also harder to accept other people. And so it
Yes,
sort of promotes a society where we're judging. Whereas if we start accepting ourselves, we're going to be um, less concerned about other people as well. We're going to not be constantly comparing ourselves, constantly trying to, you know, be like that person, or try and get
right.
somebody else's validation. It sort of creates just a society that is generally more accepting.
Right. And when I interestingly, when I decided to detransition, some of those old programs that were in my
Mhm.
head started to flare up again, where I'm like, oh my God, I have too much hair to be a woman. I have too much this to be a woman. I have too much that to be a woman. And I have to remind myself, you have two fucking X chromosomes. That's all that's required. That's it. There's nothing, there's no rules other than that. So, but again, that's that old programming coming up that if you're female, you have to be acceptably fuckable to strangers. Otherwise, you're not allowed to be happy, And it's like, it's ridiculous, but it's so deeply embedded in there that I think most people are running that program on autopilot without even questioning or realizing they're doing it. And so I've become very self-aware through this process of trying to be like, okay, this feeling came up for me. Let's follow that rabbit hole and see where it leads. A lot of deep introspection that I really wish for the future more therapists will hopefully kind of try to reintegrate back into their treatment of these people
Well,
with
that I
compassion
think is so
support.
important, and that's where the therapy bans have just, that's how I got involved in this, because it's shocking to me that therapists are now just mindlessly following this affirmation model, when really what a therapist is supposed to do is challenge. If
Right.
not to just say, oh, okay, you want to do this, you want to escape yourself, we're going to enable that. A therapist's job is to sort of push against that and try to push you towards self-acceptance of yourself as you are, not as you want to be.
And I hope that our culture can follow in suit to in some genuine degree, like with not just lip service, because right now, like again, this is a very politically divisive issue too, and I get frustrated on both sides, to be honest. I see a lot of young detransitioners who didn't get to experience what it was like in the 90s growing up kind of genderqueer or whatever, get very angry at the left right now and be like, they ruined my life. The left has destroyed everything. But at the same time, I look back in my history and I'm like, was it really the left that made me feel ashamed of myself for being a masculine woman? Or was it these very conservative views of what femininity was that made me feel like crap about myself?
Well,
And then,
that's so interesting that you say that, because I have really waffled about that, because um, I do think that there's part of me is just incredibly angry at feminism, because I feel like feminists, rather than celebrating women, said women need to be like men, and and
right.
and and that just that I feel like has fueled a lot of this, that women are unsatisfied with themselves if they're not, uber successful, if they're not able to, bring home the bacon, have a family, do all
Oh,
these
yeah.
other things.
Very complicated.
It's very complicated, but at the same time, there are messages from all sides, I think. And so I do think that it's that we have to be careful not to try and to blame one ideology, because
Right. Like,
it
I
is
think
very
the right can be very horrible and constrictive about what's permissible, and the left can be helpy helpertons to their detriment. You know what I mean?
right.
And that's kind of where we're at right now. And I would
Yeah.
really like to see this treated in a more moderate way in the future somehow,
Well, and that's
where,
it seems like we have lost the ability to be in the gray, that
yeah,
nobody wants to be moderate. Nobody wants to sort of see both sides. And hopefully people like you coming out and speaking about your experience will help to allow people to understand that it's not as black and white as they thought.
yeah. And I would say to conservatives, like, if you're genuinely concerned about this, perhaps your views about gender nonconformity need to become more open-minded,
Mhm.
because it's that horrible, like, strict gender conformity that is causing this in part. And then to the left, I would say, like, in your desire to help and validate people, you also can't lose track of acknowledging social issues that create these things. Like, these things don't come out of a vacuum. Somebody doesn't, like, I know that there's very rare cases where very young children show, like, severe gender dysphoria, what I would call, like, where they want to mutilate their bodies, this and this and that. But for the most part, what we're seeing today, you just have to use your brain. You have to look at the situation for what it is. And instead of, like, oh, we have to make everybody feel good, so let's just, like, make this umbrella term for everything, you have to, like, look at it a little bit like a scientist and be like, hey, like, we know that you're in pain and we're not invalidating your pain, but let's get to the root cause of these things, instead of just like, nope, they are what they say they are.
Right.
Shut up. Anybody who says otherwise needs to shut up.
Well, and
Like,
I
that's not
also
how to
feel
treat it.
like that the left is getting really scary with this self ID, that anybody can claim to be whatever sex they want to be, because it's really empowering predators. So men who say that they have a trans identity when in fact they don't, which is ultimately going to hurt men who have gender dysphoria,
Right. It's not going to help
and
them at
women
all.
who really don't want penises in spaces where they're feeling vulnerable.
Yeah, and it's just such a complex issue that obviously I don't have all the answers for. I don't think anybody does at this point. But yeah, just, I don't know, just being able to use common sense while still being compassionate. Like, I feel like that's what's getting lost.
Yeah, and I think the compassion is really important. And that I think that some of the compassion is actually being lost because of this new move to say that you don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans, because that's suddenly now we just have people insisting that they can identify however they want, instead
Right.
of acknowledging that this is something that causes great distress. As someone who's experienced gender dysphoria, I can attest
Yeah.
that it sucks. It's
Yeah.
really
Same.
people who don't know what it's like to feel completely and utterly uncomfortable in their body all the time have, they have no idea. It's something that you want to be very compassionate towards, but now you have people coming out and saying, oh well, I'm transgender even though I don't have gender dysphoria, and it just is
And
kind of.
really young kids too, like kids that don't even have, like, their sexual orientation figured out, let alone their gender identity.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this might be a little bit TMI, but this is, like, something I seriously thought of as I've been stopping testosterone. Like, my vaginal muscles and all those things are kicking back into gear again, and I feel orgasms differently, I
Wow.
feel arousal differently, like all these things. And I remember it feeling that way before I transitioned, but
Mm.
it just struck me that, some of these really younger kids who have settled on this identity don't even know what their genitals feel like yet. They don't even know what it feels like to be sexually aroused yet. So like,
Right.
how can you be saying that,
And they might
you
never,
know,
if they go on puberty blockers, they might never
right? They'll
experience
never get a
that.
chance to feel what their body feels like before they
Wow.
change it. And that sort of like feels, I'm just I know this is not the popular view at the moment, but I am a person that having experienced what I can experience, that erring on the side of caution, except in extreme cases, is always best. If a young child is literally trying to mutilate their body in an attempt to change it or whatever, like that's something that really needs to be worked with. That might later
But
in life
even
very very well be the kind of person who needs to have this kind of therapy,
But
but
even
for the
in that
most
case,
part,
because I was actively hitting my vagina with rocks. I was
oh my
so
God.
angry. I would, cause damage because I hated my genitals so much.
Right.
And yet here I am, all grown up and
Very comfortable. You appear to be very comfortably
most of the
female.
time. I mean, I still have times when, of course, we all have times when we're uncomfortable.
Anybody born
But
female
even
does.
someone like me who was actively trying to mutilate my body, who would have, in a second medically transitioned if given the opportunity, I feel like, it is a disorder. It is something that I believe it can be worked through, and it makes me sad that rather than doing research on what kind of effective therapies there are for this, they're instead encouraging children to medically transition.
Right. It hurts to see that it's again, it's been I mean, again, like I am all for gender nonconformity, if you even if you were born male and you want to be as feminine as wearing a dress every day of
Yeah.
your life, do it. Freaking do it. More power to you. It's just when irreversible medical procedures start becoming involved that I feel like there just needs to be more caution, and
Mhm.
I'm not saying that you should take it off the table entirely, but what we're doing right now, it's going to create like, you know, it without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, there's going to be a massive pendulum swing.
Yeah.
It's
And that
inevitable.
that worries me too, because I'm worried about the backlash that's going to occur.
All right. And I worry about the backlash for just, LGBT, like gay and lesbians in general because of that, Is there going to be such a massive backlash to this that any queer ideology whatsoever is going to get thrown out the window now? And we'll be like, oh, we need to go back to the 1950s because this is ruining people's lives. Like, you just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it'll be interesting to
yeah.
see in another couple years where we are.
Oh God, I know. I don't even know where we're going to be in a couple months.
No,
Things are
I'm
so
a little,
unpredictable.
yeah, I'm like,
This is nuts. So
well, thank
yeah.
you so much. Do you have anything else that you wanted to share before we end?
Oh geez, anything else I want to share? I think that was pretty much the meat of it. Just just wanted to, I mean, I don't know if there's anybody questioning watching this, just to know that, you feel so self-assured when you're in your early teens and your early 20s. You don't have a sense of permanence really yet. And I know I sound like
And
this
you're
old
so
person saying,
sure. You're so sure.
yeah, yeah, you're so sure and everything feels awesome in that moment, but I guarantee that who you are between your 20s and your 30s, it changes so drastically, and what you value and what's important to you change so drastically that you can't even imagine. So just be patient with yourself, like these procedures are going to be around for a long time because of how far they've advanced. This is always going to be an option, but what's not always going to be an option is learning to love yourself now,
I
as
love
you are
that.
now.
That is such a beautiful way to end it. And thank you so much for sharing your experience. I feel like your insights are going to be so important to kids who are kind of grappling with some of the issues you were grappling with as a kid.